Hello and welcome to this adventure game dev tutorial. This one's all about setting up some interactive advanced lights. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a room that is too dark to enter, and if you try and enter it, the player gets told that it's too dark. They can then use this functional light switch to turn the lights on, and we have some dynamic lights in Unity to do that. You can then enter the room and you can then even see the things in there that you couldn't see when the lights were out. I'll also go into how to store all of that in a variable so that if you leave the room and come back, the state that you left it in is remembered. So there's lots to go through, loads of other really useful tips. Let's crack on. Hello, I'm Andy, welcome to the channel. If it's your first time here, then please do hit the subscribe button, hit like, leave a comment on this video if you've got any questions about the stuff we're going through. We're going to be using Adventure Creator in Unity, which is what most of my tutorials are about, and we're going to be going through the things that we've got on screen here, creating some light 2D components, having on and off variants of them, storing the state of their visibility in a variable, using a 2D trigger so that we can actually trigger some dialogue when the player tries to walk into the room. And then when we actually use the light switch, we're going to change the walkable area in the room, and we're going to change the camera so that then we can reveal the hotspots that are actually hidden in the room. So there's quite a lot to go through, but hopefully the setup that I've got as I talk you through it, it's actually quite straightforward when you get to grips with it, and there'll be loads of other use cases for this kind of thing. So let's dive in. So I'm using Adventure Creator version 1.84.3. It's currently October 2025, and I'm on Unity version 6.2, but I'm sure if you're watching this later, perhaps even years later, that a lot of this will still apply, but they're the current versions of the things that I am running at the moment. So we're going to have a look at the scene that I've got set up rather than building this from scratch, because that would take an awful long time. If you've watched any of my other tutorials, which I highly recommend, you'll see I'm using something called rainbow hierarchy to colour some of my scene items, just because there's a lot in the scene to go through. But what we're going to start with first is looking at these lights. So in the lights group, what we've got are some light 2Ds. So these are Unity's own components, which are kind of pixel lights effectively. So if I edit that shape, you can see it's actually a shape with a fall off and everything that you can draw out to light your scene. So this has got nothing to do with Adventure Creator. This is actually an inbuilt Unity component, a light 2D. So you can just create some of them. I have got one which is kind of spilling in from the other room so that it gives the player something that they can see in the room before they see the whole lot. If I turn all of these lights off, there's the actual scene itself without any lighting. It starts off with just this one spill light coming in the door, but there are some other lights that I've set up which are the lights as it will be when all the lights come on. So if I show you that, let's bring that into the scene, that's what it looks like when all the lights are on. And those eagle-eyed of you will have noticed that actually this was just positioned off the scene, and that's the trick to getting this to work really smoothly with Adventure Creator. So these two lights are actually just positioned off the screen. I've just put them at a Y value of 10, and that will come into play later. All we're going to be doing is actually positioning them suddenly on the screen, because there are reasons why you can't turn on and off these game objects or turn on and off these light 2D components. So it's much better to put any lights that you've created. I've got two here. If we have a look at them, I'll toggle them off independently. So one of them is just this general area light that's lighting the whole room slightly. And then this one, which I toggle on, is this the kind of cone, the light cone underneath this light. So there's two lights, and they're both inside a game object. And importantly, you'll notice that little save icon. There's like a little disk icon on there. for those who are old enough to remember a 3.5-inch floppy disk. This is the remember transform component from Adventure Creator, and all that's doing is it's telling Adventure Creator to remember the position, like the transform of this particular object, because we're going to set it to be off the screen at a Y position of 10, and then in an action within Adventure Creator, we're going to then put it on the screen, and then we're going to take it off the screen again. So it really is as simple as that for having the lights come on and off. There are much more advanced things you could do. You could animate them, but I think for the time being, you'll see it's relatively straightforward to set up, but it involves quite a few actions to get it all to work. So as a reminder, now you've seen that, where they're appearing and disappearing, they're currently on because I've left them toggled on. I've left them in position. It's only because they're out of the way that when you click play, it appears that the lights in the room are actually off. And then clicking this switch basically moves them down. It does a lot of other things as well we're going to go through, but that's effectively all that's happening. They're being moved down or they're getting moved up in that single action. So the other things we need to look at, you can see here in the scene view, we've got two walkable areas. We've got a walkable area which is what I've called walkable limit, which is this tiny little one here. If I click on edit, it'll light up in green. So it's this little one here. So he's restricted to only being able to walk in that walkable area until we've turned the lights on, when it switches to this walkable full, which is the much larger green walkable area for the whole room. If you notice this orange box here, that's actually a trigger. So it's in the triggers section here that I've called dark area, and that is one of these trigger 2Ds from Adventure Creator, which is waiting for the player to walk into that trigger, and when they hit the trigger, it then runs an action list to trigger the dialogue to say it's too dark, I can't go into the room. So there's a couple of things obviously to set up there. If we have a look at the trigger itself while it's on, because that bit's dead simple, I've basically drawn out a 2D trigger, made sure it overlaps the smaller walkable area so that the character can actually walk into it. And if I have a look at the action on that, basically when the character hits the trigger, I tell it to face the character to face down, so it faces the camera, and then it plays this dialogue. It's too dark in there. So that is a simple action attached to that trigger. What we've also got set up is that this walkable limit, the limited one, is set to the default one for the scene. So if we go to the Adventure Creator settings here, the default nav mesh is walkable limit, like the limited one. And what we're going to do is change that when we've pressed the light switch up here. So you'll definitely need some experience with Adventure Creator to understand all the different bits that are going on here. But those of you who use Adventure Creator are probably putting 2 and 2 together now to see the steps we're going to need to do. So we're going to start off with this light switch hotspot next. So the actual hotspot for the light switch is where everything's kind of attached to. It is just a regular hotspot 2D, one of these. It's positioned over the actual graphic of the light switch. And then I have created an interaction as you normally would using the hotspot tools in Adventure Creator. And it's this particular interaction called light switch use, which has got the majority of the logic going on in it. So I'll launch that and can have a look. So this is, I guess, a reasonably complex action with two, if you like, rungs to it. And these two rungs are basically whether the light is on already or off already. So I'm just going to step down this whole action list and hopefully it'll make sense. It's how straightforward it really is. So these are all run in turn. If this is your first time looking at one of these, I'd maybe look at a slightly simpler one first, but if you follow along, it makes sense, I think. So this is an action that causes the character to animate. So this is actually just playing a custom animation called Take, which is the same one I use to raise the character's arm. So his arm comes up as if he's taking something. I'm using that exact same piece of animation to have him reach out as if he's about to touch the light switch. So he reaches out, touch the light switch. We wait half a second because it takes about that long for his arm to reach the light switch. And it's at that point I want it all to suddenly come on. So this green box is I guess the key to remembering the state of the lights. What we're doing is we're checking a variable, a local variable that I've set up with Adventure Creator called lights are on. So we're checking to see whether this variable is true or false. I'll just slide this window across a little bit and go to the variables section. In the local variables here, I have created a new local variable called lights are on, and it's a boolean and its initial value is false. So when you first come to this room in the game, lights are on is false. So what this does, this checks the current status of that. So you just select local variable, lights are on, it automatically does entered value is equal to true. And then if the condition is met, then you drag out this little cable and we kind of go down this rung here. I sometimes find, especially when we're dealing with variables where like lights are on true, lights are on false, because you've not got two different variables, lights are on, lights are off. This is neater, but it sometimes gets a bit confusing. So what I like to do on my first action as we're heading down one of these routes is just hit the cog and use this comment, toggle comment there, and then you can put this little comment in there just to help you when you come back to this. It's like a heading for this whole rung to tell you that this is for lights are on, that is for lights are off. They're actually exactly the same steps, but effectively doing the opposite, whether or not the light is currently on or currently off. So what we're doing in this left-hand side one, we're going to turn the lights on. So if you think back to how we started, I was showing you that I was actually moving the lights from a Y position of 10 to a Y position of 0. Now, unfortunately, there's a million ways to skin a cat, but just using the object transform option, it has to be a movable object, and that adds even more complexity. So what we're actually doing here is we're teleporting that item, which is the storeroom lights. So that's the this object here in the hierarchy, which has basically got all of the other lights inside it. We're teleporting it to a particular marker on the screen, and what I've done is I've just created two markers, one called lights on down here and one called lights off, and they're positioned at the exact transform that I want these lights to move to. So if we just close that down and have a quick look, lights on, if I go and have a look at that, it's just a marker 2D, so one of the Adventure Creator marker 2Ds, and it's set to 0, 0, 0, and lights off is another marker 2D which is set to 0, 10, 0, which is basically up off the screen there. So you can see those two green markers. I'm going to zoom right the way out there. One's down here right in the middle and one's right up there. So we're going to use those two markers to teleport that light thing to in this action. So let's bring it back up again. So that's all that's happening here. We're going to teleport the parent of those two lights to the marker 2D lights on, and then we're going to move on. We're then going to set the variable that we just checked here. We're going to set it to true now because the lights are now on, we're then going to switch the camera to a different camera called camera lights on, and I'll explain the reason why in a moment. We're then going to change the default nav mesh to that walkable full area nav mesh, and then finally we're going to turn off that dark area trigger, so that because the lights are on, you don't want the character to trigger that dialogue when they walk through there anymore. And then the very final action, it doesn't have to be down here, it could have been further up, but it was just to demonstrate that if you've branched off into lots of branches, you can pull those branches back to another branch if you need to. In this case, all I'm doing is resetting the character to idle, because they played an animation to lift their arm, and I want to make sure they're reset to idle before they do anything else, just in case I want them to do something else. So that left-hand side branch of turning the lights on, the right-hand side branch is ultimately exactly the same steps, but we're just turning things off. So we're teleporting the lights to the one that's the lights off marker, which is off screen. We're then setting the lights are on variable to false. We're switching back to the original camera that's called cam lights off, and we're switching back to the limited walkable area, and then we're turning on the trigger again. So it's basically the same thing going on. You could, if you really fancied it, pull all of these actions into an action list asset that just has some parameters, and you could run it all in one chain and set the parameters to separately. It's probably overkill. This is fine as it is, and it helps us to see what's going on. So the bit about the camera, why we're switching the camera, I've created two cameras, if I can find them. So cam lights on and cam lights off. There's nothing different about these cameras apart from the hotspots that are in the room, which currently is just these boxes here. They are set, so these box hotspots, that's a mouthful, isn't it? These box hotspots there are limited only to the lights on camera, so they basically will never be mouse overable until we're using the lights on camera. And that for me is probably the fastest way, because eventually this storeroom's going to have lots of different hotspots in it. I would either have to be limiting them all to another trigger that the player would have to be in before they could touch them, or I'd have to independently be turning all of them on and off, which is would take a long time. So I think it's the most elegant way to just have this lights on camera, and any of the hotspots that aren't visible because it's dark are limited to that lights on camera. It would also give you the flexibility as well to have some different behaviors on the cameras, perhaps even a different shader connected to a camera or something. So when the lights are on, you could do all of that related to the camera. It's one extra step in the chain, but it makes it really handy for later on. So knowing how everything's working there, let's just run that through again. Let's just have a recap, and we'll see. So this time I'm going to run it in a window here so you can see some of the things going on. So if you remember right at the start, he's on that restricted walkable area, and if I try and click to walk over here, he's going to hit that trigger that I've got selected here, this dark area, and that's going to cause the conversation. It's too dark in here. The hotspot itself, we know the light switch is going to run all of those different actions at the same time. You can see over here that the local variable lights are on false is false. When you click this, you'll actually see that change in real time. So you click the light switch, it suddenly flicks to true, and everything's now jumped down onto the into the right position, and the walkable area will have now switched in the scene as well. So the nav mesh is now walkable full, so that's switched over as we did it. We can now walk all the way in, and this hotspot for the boxes is now active because we've switched to the other camera as well. If we cam lights off, go cam lights on. This is the one that's being used now, rather than cam lights off. So if we leave the room with the lights on, because that variable is a local variable that's in the other scene, because we've actually loaded a whole new scene here, when I come back into the other scene, back to the storeroom, you can see its local variable loads back up, and it's remembered so that it knows it was on. If I turn it off, you'll see it go back to false, leave the room, it disappears because we've loaded a completely different scene, come back, local variable still false, turn it back on. And that's why it's also really, really important to use the remember transform on these lights. So the storeroom lights here, this little save icon, this is the remember transform component that's being used. Otherwise, when we left the scene and came back, it would have forgotten the position of these lights. So they would probably go back to this off state. So you must remember to put remember transform if you've moved something with a teleport. Similarly with the walkable and the two different walkables, they need a constantID. I think Adventure Creator gives a constantID component automatically now, so that it remembers which walkable area is in use. And you can also see on that trigger that has also got a remember trigger on it, so that when you come back it remembers whether or not that trigger is active or not. So hopefully that all makes sense. Hopefully that's all been really useful, and it should give you lots of other thoughts about how you can use those particular components, those particular actions, to have that kind of effect, and what kind of other dynamic things you could do. The lights themselves are really, really powerful. You can see how they're actually lighting the sprite from multiple directions. So you could do some really cool stuff with different buttons. This little alarm could set off a kind of red lights and things like that. They could do all kinds of different stuff and have lights that are kind of controllable. So hope that's been really useful. Please do, if you haven't already, subscribe. Please leave a comment if you've any questions about that particular tutorial, or you've got any better ways of doing it. I'm all ears, definitely. Thanks for tuning in. Have a look at some of the other stuff on the channel, and hopefully I'll see you again on another video.